goodness. Good lord.
It
scared me.
Did you hear that?
I did.
Do you know what that was?
I know.
That was the sound of a Halloween special.
Ooh, I like those.
Yeah, they're pretty good. And so, we're the Mediocritics.
I'm Andrew.
And I'm Kevin.
And this is Dan. He's dead.
Daniel Deddington.
He doesn't like the spookies.
Yeah, the shivery wivers. How you feeling, Dan? Yeah, I get that.
Not so good.
Not so good.
But so he's not going to be adding too much. So what are we doing?
So today we're going over our top 10 Halloween/fall movies. These aren't specifically Halloween genres or related. These are movies that just remind us of the fall, or during the fall or autumn season, Halloween season, that we watch and we enjoy. And so these are going to be our top 10. They're not going to be super in depth, but that is what it is.
Yeah, so if everything's going to be spoiler alert, so we're just going to put that out there. So if you don't want the spoilers on the movies that we're kind of blowing through, then just move ahead a little bit to catch the next one. So I think we should just roll the intro and then get into it.
Yep.
So just like my intro video, I find it hard when someone's like, pick a certain amount of movies that you really enjoy from a certain genre. I find that hard just to do off the top. So what I did was I have this chest, this box at home that generally I fill up with physical DVDs or Blu-rays that either, if it's Christmas time, I fill with Christmas movies. When it's Halloween season, I fill with anything that fills me with the autumn feeling or Halloween scary horror, whatever have you. So what I do each season is I go to one of the last remaining kind of stores that buys and sells used DVDs and Blu-rays, and I just grab a handful and I purchase them and I add it to my physical collection. So what I decided to do for my list was actually just go through the movies that I have physically and go through them. I did decide to make it really difficult for myself and put on some extra rules. So what I didn't decide to add were movies that had monsters or animals or creatures, so things like Jaws or Jurassic Park or Anaconda or The Mummy. And what I also did not add are movies that have or crime thrillers or have serial killers in them, so I didn't add Silence of the Lambs, Red Dragon, Murder by Numbers, or The Bone Collector, things like that. But I did leave in like some comedies, some older movies, some things that just give the autumn feeling for me. So that's how I picked my movies. So the first movie on my list is Hostel Part 2. So I'm starting with a sequel, and you're saying, why are you starting with a sequel? And it's because when I'm looking at a sequel, I think that it adds something to it. So Hostel is definitely, for a certain type of person, it's a gore porn movie. The first one, it pretty much deals with people who are going overseas. They stay in a hostel, and then they get wrapped up into an organization with rich clients that are paying to murder and torture, certain individuals. So what I think the second one added was, number one, it changed the main cast to females. But even more so is that they actually went to the side of the rich clients that are paying to do this. So I thought that was really interesting. So they had two individuals. One was really gung-ho about getting this done, and the second one was kind of not so sure, and they switched sides. And while the themes are pretty much there, I think it was an interesting take and built upon it.
And so my first movie is actually going to be The Conjuring, so totally unlike Hostel. Conjuring is just it's a super well done movie. I really enjoyed it. Was a very good take on the haunted house kind of movie. These are things where it's, like I said, it's things that I think what makes these movies so scary is that it's like if you're alone in a house and things are happening, this is the kind of stuff that you're afraid of. Like, these are the things that go bump in the night that you're scared of. It's not an actual thing. like, when you're scared of something, you might be scared of somebody breaking your house or something, but it's not. It's those weird things you can't explain. It's the weird things where it's like you hear a noise and you're just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Or it's more so, it's you hear a noise and then you go and check and there's nothing there. And this movie does that perfectly. It does the possession kind of stuff really well. And it's just a great time as far as, like, actually that kind of theme. And so that was my first pick, and...
Cool. The next one I have is Sixth Sense. There's honestly nothing to add to this that hasn't been said before. It's when M. Night was in his prime. I mean... In the middle, there's very questionable things, but now he might be coming back to form. I enjoyed the visit. Split was whatever for me, but I'm seeing where this universe is going. But I think Sixth Sense is just perfect in its own right, and really can't add anything more to it than that.
Yeah. For my next one, it's actually one of my. It was one of my favorite movies for last year. I want to say it's probably on my top list for movies all time. Like, I really enjoy this movie, and it's The Babysitter. It is a Netflix original. If you have not seen this movie, watch this movie. Last year, I made so many people watch this movie, including him.
And made it to my top movie of that year.
Yeah, and it is a fantastic movie. It's a comedy / horror film. It's done perfect the way that those should be done. But and this is a movie I'm not gonna spoil. But essentially what happens is a kid has a babysitter. The occult, she's in the occult, and so it kind of starts off from there. He's like doing the kind of Home Alone kind of spy on them kind of thing. And it goes from there, and it's a wild ride, but it's fun. You can watch this movie and have a good time. You don't have to think about it. It's just like, you can put this movie on and you're guaranteed to just enjoy yourself. So if you have not seen this movie, I urge you to go see this movie. This is probably my favorite Halloween-esque movie. And so we'll get to our next selection.
Yep. Going with Friday the 13th, the original, for my next one. Out of the late 70s and early 80s slasher flicks, definitely Halloween is better written by John Carpenter. It's more well done, but why I chose this one is something about it stood out to me, and that's besides the end, and naturally it's about camp counselors getting young camp counselors getting slaughtered. It's more grounded in reality, in the sense that Jason was not yet a weird, zombie thing that couldn't be killed. It was actually his mother, Pamela Voorhees, because back in the day, her son had drowned in a lake while the camp counselors were...
pointed and laughed at him.
Yeah. Or
while boning.
While doing the nasty. So I think there was a legit reason for her to be doing this. It was creepy. It's very corny, very campy, but I think it stood out because of that for me, and I enjoy watching that one.
Yeah. And going off of yours, also made my list, Friday the 13th, final chapter. So it's the fourth movie in the series. I'm going with a quadrus, whatever, I don't know, fourth one. And so there's no particular reason I'm going with this movie besides is the one I enjoy the most. It is a movie where, it's, again, Jason was dead. He's in the morgue and he comes back and he starts killing everybody. But it's just my favorite one. Not really too much to go off of besides of what Andy said already. Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees. It's nothing new to you, hopefully. And so that'll be our Friday the 13th spiel there. So.
Yeah. Up next is the Blair Witch Project, and why I chose this movie was because it's in the found footage category. It's not the first one. There are movies like Cannibal Holocaust, which that's a whole other conversation if you haven't seen it. Just Wikipedia that. It's a big mess. But it's one of those movies that was the beginning of that viral marketing campaign that was done so well. During that time, there were posters out that showed the actors were either deceased or missing, and people, when they went to see this movie, weren't actually sure if they were watching real found footage of these kids in the woods. I know it was very not controversial, but people either loved it was divisive. People were just like, it's a bunch of kids in the woods and nothing's really happening and all they're doing is yelling at each other and cursing. But I think it was one of the first that kind of really projected that type of category into the mainstream.
Yeah, I think it's like it was more like skeptical, I would say, because like you weren't sure, like I said, if it was real or not kind of thing. Going off of that, my next selection is actually something I watched last week, which is The Witch. And so it is a movie that has been on my list, has been on my watch list for a long while, and I've just kept putting it off and putting it off. I would say to watch this movie. It is a very well done movie. Very similar to what I would say probably the closest recent thing I saw was Hereditary. That same kind of style where it takes place in like the Salem, kind of like that era. Where, like, you know, you were setting up, like, farms and things like that. It was, like, the first, like, Plymouth Rock kind of thing. Like, you're setting up your colonies, and so it starts with a family who gets exiled, and things just kind of go from there where their baby goes missing, the crops start going bad, and it's one of those things where religion is so strong and kind of interwoven into the regular family that it kind of turns into, like, things are going wrong, we need to pray to God and hope things improve, and if they don't improve, then it's kind of it's like, what happens is like, oh, things are going bad for me, it must be the devil, or it must be witches, or things like that, and that's kind of where it goes, and so it's a confined movie. It's not necessarily confined to like a room or things like that from other movies, but it's confined to a farm. And so everything takes place on this farm, and it's just this family there, and it kind of turns into like almost like a stranded on an island kind of thing, where it's like they could get to places, but it's still, they're by horse and things like that, so it takes days at a time. So they're stranded in a sense, and it just turns into finger pointing and things going on, and the way that they actually ended it was very well. It wasn't actually a twist, it was not like anything outlandish by any means, because, like I said, in the title, you would assume that there's witches or it's an element of it, and they don't stray from that. And so it's a very good film, very solid, and I would recommend it for anybody who's been putting that movie off and if it's been on your list.
Another slasher, but from the 90s, for me, is The Scream. The first one, and that was done by Wes Craven, and you know that was amongst like I Know What You Did Last Summer or Urban Legend, things like that. But I think this movie was really good. Number one, it's nostalgia, and it was amongst my peers when we were younger. It was very a poignant take on the slasher type of movie. While it was horror, there was some comedy in it, and it was just super meta and made a lot of commentary on those types of movies itself. For instance, the killer, one of them is Sidney Prescott's, the main character by Neve Campbell, her boyfriend, and the entire movie, he's just so suspicious. You're thinking it's him. It's so obvious it is him. So in that, they subvert your expectations because you're like, that would make too much sense. It's too obvious. But it turns out that it is him. So because of that, they kind of throw you for a loop, and I think it's just a really good movie that does that.
Yeah, and so not necessarily older, definitely newer. Like a lot of the movies on my list are newer. My next pick is actually Hush, which is again a Netflix original, but it is a movie that does aspects. It has a fun aspect to it. So the main character in this movie is actually deaf and mute, and so it has a fun kind of like. It's quirky in that sense that it has like an aspect to kind of like it rides on. Yeah, it's unique. It rides on that, but they do it well. And it's not cheesy or anything like that. And so like you have the killer who is again, it's kind of Stranger-esque where it's kind of a guy who just kind of comes by and it's just she's alone at the wrong time, wrong place kind of thing. And so she's helpless in her house, and it's to the point where what happens? You know, if somebody cuts the power and electricity and you're deaf and mute, what do you do? How do you know where the person is? And they play off of that, and they do it very well.
And it's good because she's not helpless.
Yeah,
She fights back. She's very
she
clever.
does. She
and
fights
does
back.
Great things.
Similar to a movie that did not actually make my list, is Don't Breathe. And so the same way where they break into this old man's house who's blind, and so they it's that same aspect, and that's a very good movie as well. Didn't make my list, but that same thing where if you have a unique thing like that, I love it when movies do that, but they do it right and they kind of play off of it well.
Yeah. My next movie is a old classic comedy horror from 1948, and that is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. If you have any idea or any chance of knowing who Abbott and Costello are, is from the Who's On First kind of bit. If you don't know them, I would suggest checking them out if you have any interest in old movies. But the only other thing I can relate it to is a newer movie called Nice Guys that had Russell Crowe and Ryan Gosling in it. The point in that movie, if you've seen it, when he was sitting by the tree and he saw the dead body, and not necessarily starts hyperventilating, but is like trying to choke out words and trying to yell back at his partner, that is completely taken from the Abbott and Costello bit. So this movie, it wasn't just them meeting because it was by Universal, they didn't just meet Frankenstein, they met Dracula and the Wolfman, which were played respectively by the classic Bela Lugosi and Lon Chaney. And it's very wholesome, very family-like. Of course, comedy is subjective, number one, and confined to the era. But if you want to watch a movie this season with your grandparents or your mother, or you want to show it to your kids, or just experience it for yourself, it's a really classic movie.
My next pick is actually from based off a novel from Stephen King, is The Mist. It is a story you probably heard about, you probably know about, but if you have not, it's kind of about a mist that rolls into a town. It kind of starts off taking place in a supermarket, and so what happens is this mist kind of takes over the whole town, and it's very thick mist, so it's like you can't see outside of it, but what you soon figure out is if you go out in the mist, you essentially die. There's things in the mist. There's creatures, things, you're not sure what's exactly in the mist, and this movie makes my top mainly for just not necessarily throughout the whole movie, but mostly for the end of the movie. Is such a fun end, and like I said, this is going to be a spoiler, but when they're in the car and they're just driving, they're trying to get away, the end of the movie where it's just such a powerful scene where they go to the end of the movie, it zooms out for the car, and they're all killing themselves because they've run out of gas, or I forget, the car breaks down, something along those lines. But so they're all killing each other or killing themselves, and then it ends, and right as everybody's pretty much killed themselves, then the army and things kind of roll in. You see these giant, like, War of the World kind of like, not necessarily artificial, so War of the Worlds is like giant machines, but these are like giant, like Salvador Dali kind of like art, like creatures walking through. And it's just a fun take movie. A lot of movies don't do this like creature kind of unknown mist like kind of thing that well, and I think that's a movie that does it really well. So
my next one is also Stephen King. Not technically a movie, it was a miniseries in the 1990s, and it was called It. So I actually did really enjoy the most recent remake, but another one that is just very nostalgic to me. Me and my sister watched this movie miniseries a bunch of times, so much that we could quote it. And what I could say is what is worth the watch is Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise the Clown. It's nothing that holds up well. I'm not going to try to say that. You have to take into account the time that it was from and that it was a made-for-TV movie. But you could also take the cheesiness as, looking at the newer one as well, because these weren't things that are supposed to scare us. They're the things that were supposed to scare the children, and the commentary on more or less just an overarching evil in society as well, like the things that the adults do. So I think it's super fun. If you've seen the newer one but haven't seen the older one, I'm not going to go ahead and say you're going to love it because it's very different. But again, Tim Curry as Pennywise, it might get you through with just that, but I super enjoy it.
It's, going off of your evil from that, I'm gonna go into my next movie, which is Evil Dead. You've heard of it, you probably know it, but I'm going off of the original, what I would say is probably the start of what would be the cult classics, following that. This is before it becomes the comedy horror that it eventually becomes. I've actually went and I've seen they've made a musical, Evil Dead the musical, and there's just all these parody kind of things that are based off of these movies, but the original is what kind of started it. Is a movie that I always boot up during the Halloween or kind of season. It's just fun. It's just killing things, and it's just everything like that. I don't know if I would recommend watching all of them. It's gonna be a time. I don't know if you would consider it a good time. From the first one to the end one, there is a big divide. And they just kind of get silly and ridiculous. But I really enjoy the first one. I recommend going through watching them. It's a classic. You probably know about, but that's definitely one that makes my Halloween list.
My next choice is another sequel, and it's from a series that is definitely a guilty pleasure. It is Final Destination 2. So, why initially I just like the Final Destination series is the whole premise is somebody has a premonition of an oncoming disaster where many people die, and then once they come to or wake up from that, they stop it. But then everyone that they had saved ends up getting killed off in very intricate and ridiculous ways. And pretty much what that is death rewriting the wrongs or catching up to what should have happened.
Or fate or...
Yeah, so what I like about that is, sometimes maybe wind blows through hair and you see a shadow come across the wall, but there's never any sort of creature that comes out. I mean, death isn't really personified except for the mortician... the actor who plays Candyman is sometimes in there, and he gives a little bit of exposition here and there in some of the movies, but there's never really anything that happens. But in the first one, the deaths were kind of very straightforward and nothing was incredibly special about them. It was when the second one came along where they started making them almost very Rube Goldbergian, if you can say that. They started becoming very intricate and unfortunately, we're going to go and say it, very fun. It became where you were like, I want to see the next death that happened. It made it more enjoyable. And so it starts with some of the characters from the first one. Ali Larter returns as Clear Rivers, and Devon Sawa just doesn't return in the next one because he was just apparently killed by a falling brick in between the first two. But, so that's why it introduces generally a whole new cast of characters, and I just think it's a blast.
Yeah, and so for my next pick, it's actually just I don't even know if it's horror. It's The Hills Have Eyes. I don't know what it's horror, but it's like a messed up horror kind of thing. I don't know what you would classify it as. Definitely horror though. And so you probably know it, but it's just the creepiness of it, I guess. I think that's the uneasiness that you feel of it, is because people being killed is not anything new when this movie, came out. Yeah. But is definitely something where it's the weirdness of the inbreds, they're just hiding
Solitude,
in these hill tunnels. Yeah. There's definitely some very messed up scenes where they're just the mother's just giving constant birth to kids, and very weird, odd scenes, but it's definitely creepy. Being out there's something about being out in the middle of nowhere, but then realizing you're not alone.
Yeah.
because that's the whole thing. It's like you go out in the middle of nowhere and you're just like, this is the desert or canyons, whatever you may call it. And then realizing that there's people all around you and they know this area much better than you. And not only that, they're trying to kill you.
Damn right.
If not catch you and breed you.
Yeah.
And so like class, like original aside, but there is still, that's like, it was a classic remade. It's definitely I even would say like the remake's a classic at this point. But yeah, that's definitely a creepy horror movie that is always a watch for me.
My next one is Over the Garden Wall. This was actually an animated miniseries that came on Cartoon Network. It wasn't one of the first ones, but I still think it was a gamble because you don't see many of those. And I do think that it paid off. It was fronted by Patrick McHale, who is the writer and creative director of Adventure Time. So the characters themselves are very cartoony, but the backdrops of it it's luscious and gorgeous, and the musical score is completely of note here. It's like pre-1950s era. There's a lot of like folk, there's jazz, maybe some of the tunes have like New Orleans kind of feel, and it's really this mystery fantasy adventure of these two half-brothers, Wirt and Greg, who find themselves over the garden wall, and all the zany, weird, and kooky characters and encounters that they meet along the way. And I would say that it just gives me the feel. It's not necessarily horror, but gives me the feel of just autumn in general, and or fall. And I would suggest definitely checking it out if you like animation, if you like Adventure Time, if you want to check out something that's kind of new and fresh and that you don't see a lot.
Yeah, and so also my animated, which is my only anime one on my list, I'm going to go into is Coraline.
Making up a song about Coraline.
Yeah, it's one of those where it's just like, it's like Corpse Bride, things like that. It's just it's a gorgeous film. But Coraline for sure definitely has like a creepiness to it. It's almost like this like a Beetlejuiciness kind of to it, with like the parents in this movie are scary, and it's like there's certain scenes where she like the button eyes and things, and there's parts of this movie where you're like, this is an animated film, and you're just like, why do I feel so uneasy at this point in time? But it's a gorgeous film, or animation, and it's just something that like it's a fun movie to a degree. It's definitely, like I said, it's definitely creepy, definitely Halloween-esque, like many of these, like Tim Burton and things like that. It's all of those have those like darker overtones to them. But so that's my animated film that makes my Halloween list.
So for my last pick, I have Saw, another gore porn movie. I'm not proud of this. I have seen them all, and if you can give them anything, is I do think the first one was original. I think it was very confined, constrained. It had Jigsaw, the serial killer. I mean, he had this kind of corrupt morality, in the sense where someone he had thought had done something wrong. He kind of puts them in, some of them in torture devices, or just chains them up, and he gives them a way out, but generally in sadistic type of ways, so that they can reform themselves. And it's really interesting that someone could think that way. And I like the first one even more because as they go on and on and on for the other 7, 8, 9, I don't know, they kind of tried. Well, number one, they added other characters who were pretending to be Jigsaw, like Hoffman, I believe it was, the cop, and
totally diluted into like not giving people actual ways out of traps,
and it became, the story kept building upon itself, so it would go back in time, forward in time, and became very contrived. And I think what it became worse, and they tried to give him morale. Jigsaw, the serial killer, they tried to give him maybe like some morality, or try to make you feel for him in a way. By he ended up having cancer, and his wife had a miscarriage and an incident, and I found that that's not what I want. I did not want to kind of feel for this insane person who was doing something, so that's why I didn't like any of the others. But for my pick, I did pick out the first one. I thought that it was fresh and unique, and yeah, it fit into that category that most people didn't like. But initially, I thought the first one was I thought it was enjoyable.
So my last one for me is actually Let the Right One In. And so this made my list because it was a little bit different of a genre. I tried to make my list kind of diverse in the kind of things I was picking. This is what would be considered a vampire film. It is not the traditional vampire film. It's not, like your regular one where you're just like, oh.
It was between this and Twilight.
Yeah. And so, the regular, you just can't go wrong with the shirtless, glistening vampires, but I prefer the more traditional, historical, like, just kind of just, they're viewed more as monsters. Like, they're more as, like, they are in plain sight, but they're have these specific, like, rules that they kind of have to live by. They are these, like, supernatural kind of creatures that can kill you in an instant, kind of things like that. And it's more terrifying. It's more of the realm of just where it used to be like the village people used to just be scared of vampires. And so it kind of is that in modern day, kind of. And so that's kind of what this is the whole premise is, based off of the thing where a vampire cannot enter your house unless you invite them in. And it kind of is these two kids, and they go through it, and one obviously is a vampire. And so, again, this is a movie I don't feel like I should spoil anything throughout, but it does that well. It's a very, like, gritty kind of movie. Like, it's very raw in the way that it was shot and filmed, but I think it does the vampire... I think it does vampire justice. I think it does it justice, and I think it does it in a way that's not so, like, fantasized or, like, it fluffed up as, like, most is. It's very raw in the sense that this is a vampire. And this is the way that it was, like, mythical kind of vampire should be viewed. So that is where my list is going to end. And so that is our Halloween top 10 fall list.
What are your favorite movies, Dan?
Wow.
Cool, that was really great. Thanks.
Yeah, have you seen any of those?
I don't think I have.
Yeah,
to be honest.
I don't think I have either.
We'll have to check those out. Check his out more than ours.
Yeah, there must have been good picks.
Yeah.
Well, as always, guys, subscribe, leave a like, comment, things you might want to see us do, things you enjoyed about this list. Let us know some of your favorite Halloween movies, and most important,
have a happy Halloween.
And stay mediocre.